When most people hear the word Viking, a remarkably vivid picture immediately forms in their minds. They imagine towering warriors with horned helmets, swinging axes as they leap from dragon-headed ships onto the shores of terrified villages while smoke rises behind them. It is an image that has become so familiar through films, television, novels, and artwork that many assume it is simply history. Yet one of the first lessons historians learn is that the most recognizable image of the Vikings is, in many ways, the least reliable. The real Vikings were certainly capable of extraordinary violence, and some of their raids genuinely shocked the medieval world. But they were also farmers, fishermen, blacksmiths, merchants, explorers, poets, lawmakers, shipbuilders, craftsmen, and settlers. They established thriving towns, crossed oceans that many believed could not be crossed, traded with civilizations stretching from North America to the Middle East, and left a legacy that continues to shape Europe today. Before we can understand who the Vikings were, however, we must first answer a more fundamental question. How do we know anything about them at all? Unlike the Romans, who filled libraries with histories, laws, military records, and personal letters, the Vikings left surprisingly little written material describing themselves during the height of the Viking Age. This immediately presents historians with a challenge. Imagine trying to reconstruct the history of the modern world if almost every book, newspaper, government archive, website, and photograph suddenly disappeared, leaving behind only buildings, buried objects, scattered inscriptions, and descriptions written by foreign visitors who often viewed your society with fear or suspicion. That is remarkably close to the situation historians face when studying the Vikings. The Viking Age, usually dated from the late 8th century until the middle of the 11th century, survives not because the Vikings carefully documented every voyage and every king, but because fragments of their world have endured in many different forms. Each fragment tells only part of the story. The task of the historian is to assemble those fragments into the most accurate picture possible, while resisting the temptation to fill every gap with speculation. One of the richest sources of evidence comes from archaeology. Unlike written records, archaeological discoveries do not have opinions or agendas. A buried longhouse cannot exaggerate its owner's achievements. A broken cooking pot cannot invent a glorious victory in battle. Every object recovered from the ground represents a direct connection to someone who actually lived. Across Scandinavia and beyond, archaeologists have uncovered thousands of Viking farms, workshops, marketplaces, burial grounds, harbors, and settlements. They have found swords worn smooth by years of use, children's toys carved from wood, weaving tools used by women, trade weights, imported silks from Asia, Islamic silver coins, combs fashioned from antler, gaming pieces, fishing equipment, and the remains of ships buried beneath enormous earthen mounds. Individually, each discovery may seem ordinary. Together, they reveal an astonishingly complex society whose daily life extended far beyond raiding. The Viking ships themselves provide another remarkable source of knowledge. In several fortunate cases, entire ships were preserved beneath burial mounds where clay soils and careful construction protected the wood for more than 1,000 years. These discoveries transformed our understanding of Viking engineering. Historians no longer had to rely on medieval illustrations or imaginative reconstructions. They could measure the ships themselves, examine every plank, every rivet, every repair, and every design choice. Modern experiments, including the construction of full-scale replicas using traditional methods, have demonstrated just how seaworthy these vessels truly were. By sailing these replicas across the North Atlantic under conditions similar to those faced by Viking crews, researchers have gained insights that no written source alone could ever provide. History is not always discovered in libraries. Sometimes it must be sailed across an ocean. Written evidence does exist, but it must always be approached with caution. Much of what contemporary Europe wrote about the Vikings came from monks, priests, and chroniclers who encountered them during violent raids. These writers often described terrifying attacks on monasteries and towns, emphasizing the destruction they witnessed. Their accounts are invaluable because many were written by eyewitnesses or near contemporaries, yet they also reflect the perspectives of victims rather than participants. A monk watching armed strangers burn his monastery is unlikely to pause and record their agricultural practices, legal traditions, or family life with equal attention. Historians therefore ask an essential question whenever they read such accounts. What was this author trying to communicate? And how might that purpose have shaped what was included or omitted? Perhaps the most famous written sources connected to the Vikings are the Icelandic sagas. These remarkable works tell stories of explorers, settlers, feuds, voyages, kings, and families in extraordinary detail. Many readers assume they are straightforward historical records. The reality is more complicated. Most of the sagas were written down in Iceland during the 13th century, roughly 200 years after many of the events they describe. For generations, these stories had survived primarily through oral tradition before finally being recorded by educated Christian authors. This does not make the sagas worthless. Quite the opposite. They preserve names, places, customs, legal practices, and social values that frequently align with archaeological discoveries. Yet historians cannot simply accept every dramatic conversation or heroic duel as literal fact. Instead, the sagas are treated as a conversation between memory and history, preserving genuine traditions while also reflecting the storytelling culture of medieval Iceland. Another fascinating source comes from the Vikings themselves, though it is often brief. Across Scandinavia stand thousands of runestones, large stones carved with inscriptions using the runic alphabet. Some commemorate family members who died overseas. Others celebrate bridge builders, successful voyages, or prominent individuals. A few mention kings or distant lands. Unlike lengthy chronicles, runestones usually say very little, sometimes only a handful of carefully chosen words. Yet because many were carved by people who actually knew the individuals being remembered, they provide some of the closest voices we possess from the Viking world itself. Their brevity can be frustrating, but their authenticity is invaluable. Historians also increasingly turn to scientific techniques that would have seemed unimaginable only a generation ago. Ancient DNA analysis reveals patterns of migration and family relationships. Tree ring dating can determine precisely when timber was cut to construct buildings or ships. Chemical analysis of teeth and bones allows researchers to estimate where individuals grew up by comparing isotopes absorbed during childhood with local geological signatures. Microscopic examination of pollen preserved in ancient soils reveals what crops were cultivated and how landscapes changed over centuries. Even tiny fragments of animal bones recovered from garbage pits can reveal what people ate, what they hunted, what they imported, and how they managed their farms. Every scientific advance adds another piece to a puzzle that historians have been assembling for centuries. As exciting as these discoveries are, one of the defining characteristics of responsible history is a willingness to admit uncertainty. Popular history sometimes presents the past as though every question has already been answered. Professional historians usually see things differently. They often spend as much time discussing what remains unknown as what is well established. Did every Viking expedition have the same purpose? Certainly not. Were all Scandinavians Vikings? No. Did every raid unfold exactly as later stories described? Almost certainly not. Were women sometimes active participants in long-distance travel, trade, or even warfare? The evidence continues to be studied and debated. The picture of Viking society has changed repeatedly over the past century, not because historians cannot make up their minds, but because new discoveries continually force old assumptions to be reconsidered. That willingness to revise conclusions is not a weakness of history. It is one of its greatest strengths. Every generation uncovers new evidence, develops new technologies, and asks new questions of the past. The Vikings have not changed during the last 1,000 years, but our understanding of them certainly has. As archaeologists uncover another buried harbor, another silver hoard, another forgotten farmstead, or another weathered runestone emerging from Scandinavian soil, the story becomes just a little clearer. Some familiar legends fall away. Others prove surprisingly close to the truth. Many mysteries remain unresolved, and perhaps they always will. Yet it is precisely within those uncertainties that history remains alive. Throughout this journey, we will return to the same three questions again and again. What do historians know? How do they know it? And where does the evidence end, leaving room not for certainty, but for thoughtful curiosity? Those questions, more than any sword or longship, will guide us through the remarkable world that lay beyond the myths of the Vikings. Before the first Viking longship appeared on the coast of England, before the monastery at Lindisfarne became forever linked with the beginning of the Viking Age, and before Scandinavian explorers pushed into the icy waters of the North Atlantic, the people who would one day be known as Vikings had already been living in northern Europe for thousands of years. To understand why the Viking Age began when it did, historians must first ask a deceptively simple question. What kind of world produced the Vikings? Like so many questions in history, the answer does not lie in a single event or a single king. Instead, it emerges gradually from archaeology, climate studies, ancient settlements, and the slow accumulation of evidence that reveals how generations of ordinary people adapted to one of Europe's most demanding landscapes. The Vikings did not suddenly appear from nowhere in the late 8th century. They were the descendants of countless farmers, fishermen, traders, craftsmen, and sailors whose lives had been shaped for centuries by the mountains, forests, seas, and long winters of Scandinavia. When historians speak of Scandinavia during the centuries before the Viking Age, they are referring primarily to the regions that today comprise Norway, Sweden, and Denmark, although cultural connections extended into parts of Finland and across the Baltic Sea. Even then, these were not unified kingdoms with clearly defined borders. They were landscapes of scattered communities separated by dense forests, rugged mountain ranges, broad rivers, and deep fjords carved by glaciers during the last ice age. For much of the year, travel over land was slow and difficult. The sea, surprisingly, was often the easier route. Countless sheltered bays, winding waterways, and navigable rivers connected communities far more efficiently than rough forest trails ever could. This geography would eventually encourage one of the greatest maritime cultures in history, but centuries before the famous longships, the sea had already become the natural highway of northern Europe. Archaeology tells us that people had occupied Scandinavia since the glaciers retreated at the end of the last ice age, roughly 12,000 years ago. The earliest inhabitants lived as hunters and gatherers, following migrating reindeer, fishing rich coastal waters, and adapting to dramatic seasonal changes. Over many centuries, agriculture slowly spread northward from continental Europe. Farming never entirely replaced hunting and fishing, however. Instead, Scandinavian communities developed a mixed economy that reflected their environment. Families cultivated barley, oats, and rye where the soil permitted, raised cattle, sheep, goats, and pigs, fished rivers and coastlines, hunted elk and deer, gathered berries and nuts, and harvested timber from immense forests that seemed almost limitless. Excavations of ancient farms reveal that survival depended less on specialization than on flexibility. Every season brought different work, and every member of the household contributed in ways that modern society often overlooks. How do historians know this? Much of the evidence comes from remarkably ordinary discoveries. Charred grains preserved in ancient hearths reveal which crops were grown. Animal bones discarded into refuse pits identify the livestock people raised and the wild game they hunted. Fossilized pollen trapped within lake sediments shows when forests were cleared for agriculture and how landscapes changed over centuries. Microscopic analysis of ancient soils reveals grazing patterns, while preserved wooden tools and iron implements demonstrate the techniques used to cultivate the land. Even the placement of farm buildings tells a story. Excavated longhouses often combined living quarters, workshops, and shelter for animals beneath a single roof, allowing livestock to provide warmth during the bitter Scandinavian winters. These discoveries may lack the excitement of buried treasure, but together they provide an intimate portrait of daily life long before written history reached the region. One of the most striking characteristics of pre-Viking Scandinavia was its abundance of natural resources. Vast forests supplied timber for homes, tools, and eventually ships. Rivers and bogs provided iron ore that could be smelted into durable weapons and farming equipment. Rich fisheries sustained coastal settlements, while the Baltic Sea connected northern Europe to an expanding web of trade. Amber collected along southern shores became a prized luxury throughout Europe and even reached the Roman Empire. Long before the Viking Age, merchants carried Scandinavian products southward while returning with glassware, jewelry, wine, fine ceramics, and coins. Archaeologists have uncovered Roman artifacts hundreds of kilometers from the empire itself, demonstrating that although Rome never conquered Scandinavia, its influence reached far beyond its frontiers through commerce. This raises another fascinating question. Did the Romans know about the people who lived in Scandinavia? The answer is yes, although their knowledge was limited. Roman authors occasionally described distant northern tribes beyond the empire's borders, relying on reports from merchants and travelers rather than first-hand observation. These accounts mention peoples living in cold climates surrounded by forests and seas, but the descriptions are often vague and sometimes contradictory. Historians therefore treat these writings cautiously. They remind us that Scandinavia was not isolated from the rest of Europe, yet they reveal far more about Roman perceptions than about Scandinavian society itself. Once again, understanding history requires balancing written accounts against archaeological evidence. During the centuries after the decline of the Western Roman Empire, Northern Europe entered a period of profound change. Political authority fragmented across much of the continent. Trade routes shifted. New kingdoms emerged while others disappeared. In Scandinavia, local chieftains competed for influence, alliances formed and dissolved, and communities increasingly accumulated wealth through trade as well as agriculture. Archaeologists have uncovered increasingly elaborate burial sites from this period, some containing imported luxury goods from astonishing distances. These burials suggest that certain individuals exercised considerable authority and possessed access to extensive trading networks. Yet they also raise questions historians cannot fully answer. Were these powerful leaders hereditary rulers, successful merchants, accomplished warriors, or some combination of all three? The evidence hints at social complexity, but it rarely provides complete certainty. Religion during this period is another area where archaeology has proven indispensable. Before the arrival of Christianity, Scandinavian beliefs centered upon a rich spiritual tradition that modern audiences often know through later Norse mythology. Gods such as Odin, Thor, and Freya would eventually become famous throughout the world. But our understanding of pre-Christian religion remains incomplete because most surviving descriptions were written centuries later by Christian authors in Iceland. Archaeological discoveries help fill some of these gaps. Small figurines, ritual objects, ceremonial sites, sacrificial deposits recovered from lakes and bogs, and the orientation of graves all provide clues about spiritual practices. Yet historians remain cautious. A carved figure may suggest religious significance, but it cannot explain every belief associated with it. Material evidence reveals actions far more readily than thoughts. Perhaps nothing better illustrates the gradual evolution toward the Viking Age than the development of ships. Long before spectacular overseas expeditions captured the attention of Europe, Scandinavian boat builders had spent generations refining their craft. Early vessels became progressively larger, lighter, and more seaworthy as builders perfected the clinker construction technique, overlapping wooden planks fastened together with iron rivets. This method produced flexible hulls capable of surviving rough seas, while remaining light enough to be carried short distances over land if necessary. Archaeological finds demonstrate that shipbuilding technology evolved steadily rather than appearing suddenly. Every improvement represented accumulated knowledge passed from one generation of craftsmen to the next. By the time the Viking Age began, Scandinavian shipbuilders possessed centuries of practical experience, allowing them to construct vessels unlike any Europe had previously seen. One of the enduring myths about the Vikings suggests that they were somehow destined to become raiders, simply because they were fierce people living in a harsh land. Historians today generally reject such simplistic explanations. Geography certainly influenced Scandinavian society, but harsh climates alone do not produce explorers. Many regions experience difficult conditions without launching transoceanic expeditions. Instead, historians see a combination of factors gradually converging. Population growth may have increased competition for productive farmland. Political rivalries encouraged ambitious leaders to seek wealth and prestige. Expanding trade networks revealed opportunities beyond Scandinavia, shipbuilding technology reached remarkable levels of sophistication. European monasteries accumulated considerable wealth while often possessing limited defenses. None of these developments alone explains the Viking Age, but together they created conditions in which overseas voyages became increasingly attractive. Here, however, we encounter another important example of historical uncertainty. Why did the Viking Age begin around the late 8th century, rather than 50 or 100 years earlier? Despite decades of research, no single answer commands universal agreement. Some historians emphasize economic incentives, others political competition, technological innovation, demographic pressures, or changing patterns of European trade. The evidence supports elements of each explanation, while definitively proving none of them in isolation. History rarely unfolds because of one cause alone. More often, it resembles countless streams gradually merging into a river, whose direction becomes apparent only in retrospect. As we leave this chapter, the familiar image of the Viking suddenly looks rather different. Instead of an axe-wielding raider emerging mysteriously from the northern mist, we begin to see generations of ordinary people patiently building the foundations of an extraordinary civilization. Farmers clearing forests one field at a time, blacksmiths refining iron-working techniques, shipbuilders experimenting with new hull designs, traders carrying amber, furs, and iron to distant markets, families adapting to the rhythms of long winters and short summers. None of them could have known that their descendants would eventually cross the Atlantic Ocean centuries before Columbus, establish kingdoms abroad, reshape European politics, and become one of history's most recognizable cultures. Yet the evidence suggests that the Viking Age was not born in a single dramatic moment. It was quietly constructed over centuries, long before anyone in Europe ever called them Vikings. If there is a single object that defines the Viking Age more than any crown, sword, or runestone, it is the longship. Without it, there would have been no voyages across the North Atlantic, no settlements in Iceland or Greenland, no raids on England, no trading expeditions to Constantinople, and almost certainly no Viking Age as historians understand it today. The longship was not merely a means of transportation. It was the technological achievement that transformed an already capable maritime people into one of the greatest seafaring civilizations in history. Yet one of the most fascinating aspects of the Viking longship is that it did not suddenly appear fully formed, as though some forgotten inventor had one day designed the perfect vessel. Archaeology tells a very different story. The famous ships of the 9th and 10th centuries were the product of hundreds of years of gradual experimentation, refinement, and accumulated knowledge. They were the result of countless anonymous craftsmen improving upon the work of those who came before them. One plank, one rivet, and one voyage at a time. How do historians know this? Once again, the answer lies beneath the ground. During the 19th and 20th centuries, several remarkable discoveries fundamentally changed our understanding of Viking shipbuilding. Some of the most famous ships had been preserved inside burial mounds, where layers of clay and earth protected the timber from decay for over 1,000 years. When archaeologists carefully uncovered these vessels, they found not crude raiding boats but masterpieces of engineering. Every board had been shaped with astonishing precision. Every joint reflected deliberate craftsmanship. Every curve of the hull balanced speed, flexibility, strength, and seaworthiness in ways that modern naval architects continue to admire. These discoveries allowed historians to move beyond medieval illustrations and legends. They could now study the ships themselves, measuring every dimension and reconstructing the techniques used to build them. Perhaps the greatest surprise was how light these vessels actually were. Popular culture often portrays Viking ships as enormous floating fortresses built for war alone. Yet many longships were remarkably graceful. Their shallow draft allowed them to sail across open seas while also navigating surprisingly shallow rivers and estuaries. In some cases, a crew could even drag a ship overland between waterways, opening routes that larger vessels could never use. This flexibility explains much of the Vikings' success. European defenders often expected danger to arrive only from the sea. Yet Viking crews could appear unexpectedly far inland by following rivers deep into the continent. What seemed impossible to many medieval observers was simply another consequence of exceptional ship design. One of the defining features of Viking ships was their clinker-built construction, a method in which overlapping wooden planks formed the hull rather than lying edge to edge. At first glance, this overlap may appear insignificant, but it represented a profound engineering advantage. Instead of creating a rigid shell that resisted every wave, the hull possessed a slight flexibility. As heavy seas rolled beneath the ship, the structure could move subtly with the water, reducing stress on the timbers while maintaining remarkable strength. Modern replica voyages have repeatedly demonstrated that these ancient ships perform exceptionally well in rough conditions, often surprising experienced sailors who expect such slender vessels to be unstable. Once again, archaeology alone could reveal only part of the story. By reconstructing full-scale ships using traditional tools and techniques, historians have been able to test ancient craftsmanship under real conditions, discovering that Viking builders understood their environment with extraordinary sophistication. The raw materials themselves also tell an important story. Scandinavian forests provided vast quantities of oak, pine, and other durable timber, but selecting the right tree required considerable skill. Shipbuilders often sought naturally curved branches or trunks whose shapes already resembled the structural components they intended to create. Rather than forcing straight wood into unnatural forms, they worked with the grain, preserving the timber's natural strength. Every plank was split rather than sawn whenever possible, following the grain to maximize durability. Iron rivets fastened overlapping boards together, while animal hair, wool, moss, and tar sealed joints against the relentless intrusion of seawater. Nothing about the process was hurried. Constructing a fine ship demanded enormous labor, specialized knowledge, and access to valuable resources. A successful longship represented not only technological expertise, but also considerable wealth. How do historians know the details of this construction process when no Viking shipbuilder left behind an instruction manual? Much of the evidence comes from microscopic examination of preserved tool marks. Archaeologists can identify the types of axes and adzes used to shape individual timbers. Experimental archaeologists then recreate those same tools and attempt to reproduce identical marks on freshly cut wood. Through this painstaking work, they gradually reconstruct ancient building techniques that written records never described. Excavations of shipyards, woodworking sites, discarded tools, and unfinished vessels add further evidence. History, in this case, resembles detective work, conducted with wood fibers, iron fragments, and centuries of accumulated craftsmanship. Contrary to another common misconception, not every Viking ship was a longship designed for raiding. The word longship refers to a specific class of vessel optimized for speed, maneuverability, and carrying warriors. Scandinavia also produced broad cargo ships known today as knars, built primarily for commerce rather than combat. These merchant vessels sacrificed speed in exchange for cargo capacity, allowing traders to transport livestock, timber, furs, grain, iron, textiles, and countless other goods across astonishing distances. It was likely ships of this type that carried settlers to Iceland and later to Greenland, transporting families, livestock, tools, and everything necessary to establish entirely new communities. The existence of these different ship types reminds us that Viking society cannot be reduced to warfare alone. The same civilization that built raiding vessels also built the commercial network that connected much of northern Europe. Navigation presents another enduring mystery. Modern audiences often imagine Viking captains relying upon secret instruments or mystical knowledge to cross the North Atlantic. The reality appears both more ordinary and, in some ways, even more impressive. Historians believe Viking navigators combined careful observation with generations of practical experience. They watched the position of the sun, stars, prevailing winds, ocean swells, bird migrations, drifting seaweed, whale behavior, cloud formations over distant land, and even the color of the water itself. Every voyage added to a growing body of knowledge passed orally from one generation of sailors to the next. Although no surviving Viking navigation manual exists, The consistency with which they reached destinations separated by hundreds or even thousands of kilometers suggests remarkable navigational skill. One question that often fascinates both historians and the public concerns the so-called sunstone, a crystal described in later Icelandic literature that may have helped determine the position of the sun on cloudy days. Did Vikings truly use such devices? Here we encounter an excellent example of historical uncertainty. Certain naturally occurring crystals can indeed reveal the sun's position through polarized light, even under overcast skies, and laboratory experiments demonstrate that the principle is scientifically sound. Yet direct archaeological evidence linking these crystals to routine Viking navigation remains limited. Historians therefore remain cautious. It is entirely possible that some navigators employed such techniques, but the evidence is not yet sufficient to declare the matter settled. This illustrates an essential principle of historical scholarship. A fascinating possibility is not automatically an established fact. The longship also reflected Viking society itself. Unlike the great galleys of the Mediterranean, which often depended upon enslaved rowers chained to their benches, Viking crews generally consisted of free men working together toward a common goal. Every oar demanded coordination. Every sail required teamwork. Every landing depended upon discipline. Archaeological evidence from ship burials suggests that vessels carried not only warriors but also tools, provisions, cooking equipment, repair materials, and personal belongings, revealing that long voyages required careful planning rather than reckless courage. A successful expedition was as much a logistical achievement as a military one. Perhaps the greatest testament to Viking shipbuilding lies not in the ships themselves, but in the distances they traveled. Within only a few generations, Scandinavian sailors reached the British Isles, Ireland, France, the Baltic, Russia, the Byzantine Empire, the Islamic world, Iceland, Greenland, and the shores of North America. These achievements were not accidents driven by favorable winds. They were the direct consequence of centuries spent perfecting one of history's most versatile vessels. Modern replica expeditions have repeatedly demonstrated that reconstructed Viking ships can successfully retrace many of these remarkable journeys, confirming that the archaeological evidence reflects genuine ocean-going capability rather than exaggerated legend. As historians continue uncovering fragments of ships buried beneath fields, submerged beneath harbors, or preserved within ancient graves, our understanding of Viking technology continues to evolve. Yet one conclusion has become increasingly clear. The longship was not simply an invention. It was the culmination of an entire civilization's relationship with the sea. Generations of fishermen learned its moods. Generations of traders mapped its routes. Generations of craftsmen refined its tools. Generations of sailors accumulated hard-earned knowledge that no written manual could fully capture. By the late 8th century, when the first Viking expeditions began appearing in historical records across Europe, Scandinavia possessed not only courageous crews, but the finest ships on the continent. In many ways, the Viking Age did not begin because people suddenly became more adventurous. It began because, after centuries of quiet innovation, they finally possessed the means to carry that adventurous spirit farther than anyone had imagined possible. One of the most interesting questions in all of Viking history is also one of the most difficult to answer. Why did the Viking Age begin when it did? Historians have spent generations studying this question, yet no single explanation has ever gained universal acceptance. This often surprises people who imagine history as a collection of settled facts waiting to be memorized. In reality, history frequently resembles an ongoing investigation. New archaeological discoveries, advances in scientific dating, and fresh interpretations of old evidence continually reshape our understanding of the past. The beginning of the Viking Age is one of those mysteries where historians possess many pieces of the puzzle, but no single document that explains everything. There is no surviving proclamation from a Scandinavian king announcing that the era of exploration has arrived. No Viking captain left behind a diary explaining why he first sailed west across the North Sea. Instead, historians must carefully examine dozens of different clues, weighing each one against the others, until a broader picture gradually begins to emerge. Traditionally, the Viking Age is said to begin in the year 793 with the attack on the monastery of Lindisfarne, located on the northeastern coast of what is now England. Contemporary Christian chroniclers described the event with horror. To them, it seemed as though the very edge of the known world had erupted in violence. They wrote of armed, sea-borne raiders descending upon one of Christianity's holiest sites, killing monks, seizing treasures, and disappearing back across the sea before organized resistance could be mounted. Because these accounts survive in written form, Lindisfarne has long served as the symbolic beginning of the Viking Age. Yet historians today are careful to point out that the raid itself did not create the Vikings. It merely marked the first event that attracted widespread attention from literate societies capable of recording it. The processes that produced those raiders had been developing quietly within Scandinavia for centuries. How do historians know that overseas activity began before Lindisfarne? Archaeology once again provides important evidence. Scandinavian artifacts discovered in Britain and around the North Sea suggest peaceful contact, trade, and small-scale travel long before the famous raid of 793. Likewise, objects imported from the British Isles have been found in Scandinavian settlements dating to earlier decades. This suggests that merchants, sailors, and perhaps even small groups of adventurers had already begun crossing these waters well before the event that later chroniclers chose to emphasize. Written history often begins when dramatic events occur, but archaeology reminds us that history itself usually unfolds far more gradually. One explanation frequently proposed by historians involves population growth. During the centuries preceding the Viking Age, improved farming techniques and relatively favorable climatic conditions may have allowed the Scandinavian population to expand. As communities grew, competition for productive farmland likely became more intense, particularly in regions where mountains, forests, and rocky landscapes limited agricultural opportunities. Younger sons who stood to inherit little or no land may have sought wealth elsewhere. This theory possesses intuitive appeal because similar pressures have encouraged migration throughout history. Yet historians remain cautious. Although archaeological evidence indicates expanding settlements in certain areas, estimating ancient populations is notoriously difficult. We possess no census records from 8th century Norway or Sweden. Instead, population estimates rely on excavated farms, settlement patterns, pollen studies, and other indirect evidence. These clues suggest growth, but they cannot measure it with complete precision. Another compelling explanation centers on political competition. Before the emergence of unified Scandinavian kingdoms, much of the region consisted of numerous local chieftains and small rulers competing for prestige, followers, and resources. In such societies, successful leadership often depended upon generosity. A chieftain strengthened his position by rewarding loyal supporters with gifts, feasts, weapons, jewelry, and silver. To maintain that loyalty, he required a steady flow of wealth. Overseas expeditions offered opportunities to acquire exactly that. Trade could generate profits. Raiding could produce even greater rewards, albeit at far greater risk. Historians see evidence of increasingly powerful elites during this period in the form of elaborate burial mounds, imported luxury goods, large feasting halls, and expanding centers of political influence. Yet even here, uncertainty remains. Did ambitious leaders drive overseas expansion, or did successful expeditions create more powerful leaders? The relationship almost certainly flowed in both directions. Technological innovation forms another essential piece of the puzzle. As we explored in the previous chapter, Viking ships represented the culmination of centuries of gradual improvement. By the late 8th century, Scandinavian shipbuilders had perfected vessels capable of crossing open seas while remaining fast, maneuverable, and flexible enough to navigate rivers. This technological advantage dramatically expanded the range of possible expeditions. Yet historians are careful not to confuse capability with motivation. Possessing excellent ships does not automatically explain why people chose to undertake dangerous voyages. Technology creates opportunities, but human decisions determine whether those opportunities are pursued. Economic change also played a significant role. During the centuries surrounding the beginning of the Viking Age, Trade across northern Europe expanded considerably. Silver from the Islamic world flowed into Eastern Europe through vast commercial networks. Markets grew larger and more interconnected. Scandinavian merchants increasingly exchanged furs, walrus ivory, amber, iron, whetstones, slaves, textiles, and other goods for foreign luxuries and precious metals. Archaeologists have uncovered astonishing quantities of Islamic silver coins buried throughout Scandinavia, many arriving through trade routes stretching across Russia to the Abbasid Caliphate. These discoveries reveal that Scandinavia was becoming integrated into a much wider economic world. For some individuals, overseas travel offered opportunities not simply for plunder but for commerce on an unprecedented scale. The famous raids themselves may also have reflected changing conditions beyond Scandinavia. During the 8th century, many monasteries along the coasts of Britain and Western Europe accumulated considerable wealth. These institutions often possessed beautifully crafted religious objects made from gold, silver, and precious stones. At the same time, many stood in relatively isolated locations with little military protection. To an experienced sailor arriving by surprise, such sites represented tempting targets. Historians emphasize, however, that this observation does not reduce Viking activity to simple opportunistic theft. Rather, it illustrates how conditions in different parts of Europe interacted. Wealth concentrated in vulnerable locations while maritime technology made rapid surprise attacks increasingly feasible. Historical change often results not from one society alone but from the interaction of many. Climate has occasionally entered the discussion as well. Some researchers have suggested that relatively warm conditions during portions of the early medieval period may have improved agricultural productivity and made northern navigation somewhat more favorable. Others caution against assigning climate too much explanatory power. While environmental conditions undoubtedly influenced everyday life, there is little evidence that climate alone triggered the Viking Age. Once again, historians resist simple explanations. Human societies are rarely transformed by a single factor operating in isolation. One particularly interesting question concerns whether the Vikings viewed themselves as something entirely new. Modern historians often speak confidently about the Vikings. But would an 8th century Scandinavian farmer have described himself that way? The answer is uncertain. In Old Norse, the word vikingr appears to have referred more specifically to someone engaged in overseas expeditions, particularly raiding or seaborne ventures, rather than to every inhabitant of Scandinavia. Most people living in Norway, Denmark, or Sweden were farmers who spent far more time tending livestock and harvesting grain than sailing across oceans. This distinction reminds us that modern labels sometimes oversimplify historical realities. Not every Scandinavian was a Viking, just as not every Roman was a soldier, or every medieval European was a knight. How do historians know what words the Vikings themselves used? Here the evidence comes from a combination of linguistic studies, runic inscriptions, and later Icelandic literature. The sagas and poems preserve valuable clues about how medieval Scandinavians described their own world, although these sources were written centuries after many of the events they portray. Linguists compare these texts with earlier inscriptions carved into runestones and other artifacts, tracing how language evolved over time. While uncertainties remain, this careful comparison helps historians distinguish between modern assumptions and historical usage. Perhaps the greatest lesson historians have learned over the past century is that the Viking Age almost certainly had no single cause. Instead, it emerged through the convergence of numerous long-term developments. Population growth increased competition for resources. Political leaders sought wealth and prestige. Shipbuilding technology reached extraordinary levels of sophistication. Expanding trade networks revealed opportunities across Europe and beyond. Foreign societies accumulated riches that could be acquired through commerce, or by force. Improved navigation allowed increasingly ambitious voyages. Each factor reinforced the others until overseas expeditions became not exceptional adventures but a recurring feature of Scandinavian life. The attack on Lindisfarne therefore appears rather differently when viewed through the lens of modern historical research. It was not the spark that suddenly transformed peaceful farmers into fearsome raiders. It was the moment when centuries of gradual change first burst dramatically into the written history of Europe. By the time frightened monks recorded the arrival of strange ships on the horizon, The story had already been unfolding for generations in Scandinavian forests, shipyards, workshops, harbors, and villages. The Viking Age did not begin with a single raid. It began when a society that had quietly developed the skills, technology, experience, and ambition to look beyond its own shores finally decided to act upon them. That decision would reshape not only Scandinavia, but much of medieval Europe, and its consequences would soon reach coastlines that no European chronicler yet imagined were even possible to find. Few events in medieval history have become as symbolic as the raid on the monastery of Lindisfarne in the year 793. For more than 1,000 years, it has been remembered as the moment when the Viking Age burst unexpectedly onto the European stage. School textbooks often describe it as though history suddenly changed in a single afternoon, with dragon-headed ships emerging from the sea and terrifying warriors descending upon an unsuspecting monastery. Yet one of the recurring themes of this book has been that history is rarely so simple. The raid on Lindisfarne was certainly real, and it profoundly shocked those who witnessed it. But understanding what actually happened requires us to separate contemporary evidence from later legend. It also requires us to ask our three guiding questions once again. What do historians know? How do they know it? And where does the evidence leave room for uncertainty? The island of Lindisfarne lies just off the northeastern coast of present-day England, connected to the mainland by a tidal causeway that disappears beneath the sea twice each day. Even today, the location feels isolated. Winds sweep across the North Sea, seabirds circle above rocky shores, and the tides dictate the rhythm of life. In the 8th century, however, Lindisfarne was not merely an isolated monastery. It was one of the spiritual centers of the Christian world in northern Britain. Founded in the 7th century by monks from the Irish monastery of Iona, Lindisfarne had become famous for its scholarship, religious learning, and beautifully illuminated manuscripts. Pilgrims traveled there seeking wisdom, while kings supported the monastery through generous donations of land, livestock, precious metals, and finely crafted religious objects. To those who lived there, Lindisfarne represented peace, devotion, and learning. To outsiders arriving from the sea, it represented something else entirely. How do historians know what Lindisfarne looked like? Surprisingly, we know far less than many people assume. Archaeological excavations have uncovered foundations of buildings, fragments of carved stone crosses, cemeteries, workshops, and evidence of daily monastic life. Written descriptions survive from later centuries, while comparisons with similar monasteries help historians reconstruct its general appearance. Rather than imagining enormous stone cathedrals, visitors in 793 would likely have encountered a modest collection of timber and stone buildings surrounded by cultivated fields, workshops, gardens, livestock, and simple dwellings. It was an important religious community, but physically it remained vulnerable. The written accounts describing the raid come almost entirely from Christian observers. This is an important point because it immediately shapes how historians interpret the evidence. One of the most famous sources is the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, a collection of historical records compiled over many years. Another comes from the Northumbrian scholar Alcuin, who was living at the court of Charlemagne when news of the attack reached him. Alcuin expressed horror at what had occurred, describing the desecration of a place long regarded as holy. He viewed the attack not simply as a military event, but as a spiritual catastrophe, asking how such suffering could have been permitted by God. His letters provide invaluable evidence because they reflect the emotions of people living through the event itself. At the same time, historians recognize that Alcuin was writing from the perspective of a Christian intellectual deeply committed to the monastery and its religious significance. His purpose was not to produce an objective military report. It was to interpret tragedy through the lens of faith. This illustrates one of the most important principles of historical research. Every source has a perspective. That does not make it false. It simply means historians must ask why it was written and what its author hoped to accomplish. A frightened monk describing armed strangers arriving from the sea will naturally emphasize violence and destruction. He is unlikely to devote equal attention to the raiders' language, social customs, or motivations. Likewise, if we possessed an account written by one of the Scandinavians involved, which we do not, it would almost certainly emphasize different aspects of the same event. Since only one side left contemporary written descriptions, historians must constantly guard against accepting those accounts uncritically while also recognizing their immense value. Archaeology provides another perspective. Excavations at Lindisfarne reveal evidence of occupation both before and after the famous raid, suggesting that the monastery recovered rather than disappearing overnight. This challenges a common misconception created by dramatic retellings. Popular culture often portrays Lindisfarne as though it were completely destroyed in a single devastating attack. The archaeological evidence paints a more nuanced picture. Damage certainly occurred, treasures were taken, and lives were undoubtedly lost. But the community continued to exist. Over time, however, repeated threats from the sea eventually persuaded many religious communities throughout Britain to strengthen defenses or relocate valuable possessions inland. What exactly were the raiders seeking? Here, the evidence is both straightforward and revealing. Monasteries possessed concentrated wealth. Gold and silver liturgical vessels, jeweled reliquaries, finely worked metal crosses, imported manuscripts, livestock, stored grain, and other valuable goods could often be seized quickly by a relatively small group of attackers. Unlike fortified royal centers, monasteries were generally defended by monks rather than professional soldiers. Historians therefore see Lindisfarne not as a random target, but as one that combined wealth, accessibility, and vulnerability. This interpretation does not excuse the violence. It simply helps explain why such places repeatedly attracted attention during the early Viking Age. One question that often arises is whether the Vikings deliberately targeted Christianity itself. Modern evidence suggests that this was probably not their primary motivation. The raiders appear to have been interested chiefly in wealth rather than theology. Christian monasteries happened to contain concentrations of portable valuables that could easily be transported aboard ships. Had equally wealthy pagan temples existed under similar conditions, they likely would have attracted the same attention. This distinction matters because later generations sometimes portrayed the raids as a great religious conflict between pagan Scandinavia and Christian Europe. While religion certainly shaped how victims interpreted the attacks, historians generally see economic opportunity as the more immediate motive for many early raids. How do historians know the raiders came from Scandinavia? Interestingly, the earliest written sources rarely identify them with great precision. Over time, however, archaeological evidence, linguistic studies, and comparisons with later raids establish a consistent pattern linking these expeditions to Scandinavian seafarers. Weapons, ship technology, burial customs, and material culture found across Britain correspond closely with discoveries from Norway and Denmark. As additional raids occurred during subsequent decades, the identity of the attackers became increasingly clear. The raid on Lindisfarne appears not as an isolated incident, but as the beginning of a broader pattern of Scandinavian activity across the British Isles. One of the enduring myths surrounding Lindisfarne is that the attackers wore horned helmets. This image remains extraordinarily popular despite the complete absence of archaeological evidence supporting it. No authentic Viking battle helmet with horns has ever been discovered. The few helmets that have survived from the Viking Age are practical pieces of military equipment designed to protect the head in combat, not elaborate ceremonial costumes. The familiar horned Viking emerged largely during the 19th century, when artists, costume designers, and opera productions sought dramatic visual symbols for the Norse past. This serves as another reminder that some of the most recognizable images in popular history originate not from archaeology but from much later artistic imagination. Another question historians continue to debate concerns the size of the raiding force. Contemporary accounts offer few reliable numbers. Medieval chroniclers often exaggerated the scale of events, particularly when describing traumatic experiences. Modern historians therefore avoid precise estimates unsupported by evidence. A relatively small number of well-trained men arriving unexpectedly in fast ships could easily overwhelm an isolated monastery without requiring a massive army. The psychological impact of such attacks often exceeded their actual size. News traveled rapidly through Christian Europe, magnifying fear as stories spread from one monastery to another. In this sense, Lindisfarne became famous not only because of what happened there, but because of what people believed might happen next. The reaction across Europe reveals another fascinating aspect of history. To many contemporaries, the raid seemed almost unimaginable. Alcuin famously wondered how such horrors could occur in a land that had long enjoyed divine protection. Some interpreted the attack as God's punishment for human sinfulness, rather than as the result of changing political and technological conditions. This reminds us that people in the past explained events according to the intellectual frameworks available to them. Medieval Europeans did not think like modern historians. They viewed history, politics, religion, and the natural world as deeply interconnected. Understanding their perspective does not require us to share their conclusions, but it does require us to appreciate how profoundly different their worldview could be. Perhaps the greatest irony of Lindisfarne is that the raid, which came to symbolize Viking violence, also obscures much of Viking civilization. The men who landed there almost certainly came from societies whose people farmed, built ships, traded across vast distances, governed communities through assemblies, raised families, composed poetry, and navigated some of the world's most dangerous waters with extraordinary skill. None of those accomplishments would have been visible to the frightened monks watching armed strangers rush ashore. Their experience was entirely real, but it represented only one brief encounter between two very different worlds. The challenge for historians is to hold both truths at once, to acknowledge the suffering caused by the raid, while recognizing that it was carried out by members of a far more complex civilization than later stereotypes would suggest. As we move forward through the Viking Age, the attack on Lindisfarne will remain an important landmark, but it should no longer appear as the beginning of an inexplicable mystery. Instead, it becomes the first dramatic chapter in a much larger story that had been unfolding quietly for generations. The ships that arrived on that windswept shore carried more than warriors. They carried centuries of shipbuilding knowledge, expanding trade networks, political ambition, maritime skill, and cultural traditions shaped by the landscapes of Scandinavia. For the monks of Lindisfarne, those ships seemed to emerge from nowhere. Thanks to archaeology, careful scholarship, and the patient work of historians, we now know they had been a very long time in the making. If there is one misconception that has proven remarkably difficult to overcome, it is the belief that the Vikings spent their lives almost entirely raiding monasteries, burning villages, and fighting battles. It is an understandable impression. Medieval chroniclers devoted far more attention to violent encounters than to ordinary life, while modern films and television naturally gravitate toward dramatic conflict rather than peaceful commerce. Battles are exciting. Farming is not. Yet one of the greatest discoveries made by modern archaeology is that if we judged Viking society solely by its raids, we would understand only a very small fraction of what it actually was. The overwhelming majority of Scandinavians never became famous warriors. Most never crossed the Atlantic or fought in England. Like nearly every society throughout history, most people spent their lives working, raising families, solving practical problems, and trying to survive another winter. The Viking Age was not built only by men carrying axes. It was sustained by entire communities whose daily labor made exploration itself possible. How do historians know this? Once again, the answer comes not from spectacular discoveries but from thousands of ordinary ones. Archaeologists have excavated hundreds of Viking farms throughout Norway, Sweden, Denmark, Iceland, and other parts of the Norse world. These sites reveal homes, barns, workshops, storage buildings, animal enclosures, wells, ovens, and countless everyday objects that would never appear in heroic sagas. Broken pottery, weaving tools, spindle whorls, fishing hooks, iron nails, cooking vessels, children's toys, woodworking tools, combs, shoes, and animal bones tell a remarkably consistent story. Most Viking households functioned as self-sufficient farms where every member of the family contributed to daily life. There is little evidence that ordinary communities spent every season preparing for warfare. Instead, the archaeological record is dominated by agriculture, craftsmanship, and domestic activity. The Viking farm was the true foundation of Scandinavian society. Long before a young man considered joining an overseas expedition, he almost certainly grew up learning how to harvest grain, repair fences, care for livestock, split firewood, fish nearby rivers, and survive the long northern winter. The growing season across much of Scandinavia was short, leaving little room for failure. Families cultivated barley, oats, and rye where the soil allowed while raising cattle, sheep, goats, pigs, and chickens. Hay had to be gathered during the brief summer months to feed animals through winter. Roofs required constant maintenance. Boats needed repairs. Nets had to be mended. Food was smoked, dried, salted, and stored with great care because hunger was never far away. These annual rhythms changed little whether one lived in Norway, Denmark, or Sweden. Long before they became explorers, the Vikings were experts in making difficult landscapes productive. One fascinating aspect of Viking farms is how efficiently they were organized. Archaeological excavations reveal that many families lived in longhouses where people and livestock occupied different sections beneath the same roof. To modern readers, this arrangement may seem unusual, yet it made practical sense in a cold climate. Animals generated warmth that helped heat the building during winter, while remaining protected from severe weather themselves. Longhouses also served multiple functions. They were homes, workshops, storage areas, meeting places, and sometimes centers of local authority. Rather than dividing life into separate buildings for every activity, Viking households integrated work and domestic life into a single, carefully managed space. Women played an especially important role within these communities, although popular portrayals have often overlooked their contributions. Archaeological evidence demonstrates that textile production alone represented an enormous investment of time and skill. Before a single sail could propel a ship across the sea, someone had to produce vast quantities of wool, spin thread, weave cloth, and sew enormous sections together. Some historians estimate that manufacturing a single large sail required thousands of hours of labor. This immediately changes our understanding of exploration itself. Every famous voyage depended not only upon sailors and shipbuilders, but also upon the largely invisible work performed by women within Scandinavian households. The great expeditions of the Viking Age quite literally could not have sailed without them. How do historians know who performed these tasks? Here the evidence becomes especially interesting. Excavated settlements contain large numbers of spindle whorls, loom weights, needles, shears, and textile fragments. Graves sometimes include tools associated with spinning and weaving, while later Icelandic literature frequently describes women overseeing household production. Historians remain careful not to assume that every task was divided identically across all communities. But the combined archaeological and literary evidence strongly suggests that textile production occupied a central place in Viking society. In recent decades, scholars have increasingly recognized that understanding the Viking Age requires studying cloth as carefully as swords. Craftsmanship flourished throughout Scandinavia as well. Blacksmiths produced tools, weapons, nails, locks, keys, farming implements, and countless other necessities. Woodworkers built houses, carts, barrels, furniture, and ships. Leatherworkers fashioned shoes, belts, bags, and harnesses. Bone and antler craftsmen created combs, gaming pieces, knife handles, and decorative carvings. Jewelry makers produced intricate brooches, necklaces, rings, and ornaments whose quality continues to impress modern archaeologists. Excavated workshops reveal specialized production far beyond what earlier historians once imagined. Viking society was not technologically primitive. Within the limits of early medieval Europe, it displayed remarkable craftsmanship across many different trades. Trade formed another essential pillar of everyday life. Although isolated farms produced much of what families required, Scandinavia was increasingly connected through regional and international markets. Coastal settlements grew into bustling trading centers where merchants exchanged furs, iron, amber, walrus ivory, soapstone, whetstones, timber, honey, wax, and textiles for silver, glassware, fine ceramics, silk, spices, and other imported goods. Archaeological discoveries reveal that some Scandinavian towns contained merchants from many different cultures, creating surprisingly cosmopolitan communities for the early Middle Ages. Long before globalization became a modern term, Viking merchants were participating in trade networks stretching across Europe and into Asia. One of the most remarkable discoveries supporting this picture comes from the enormous quantities of Islamic silver coins uncovered throughout Scandinavia. Tens of thousands of these coins, known as dirhams, have been recovered from hoards buried across Sweden, particularly on the island of Gotland. Many bear Arabic inscriptions and originated thousands of kilometers away within the Abbasid Caliphate. The coins themselves often show little evidence of circulation before reaching Scandinavia, suggesting they traveled rapidly through expanding trade routes across Eastern Europe. They remind us that Viking society was connected to civilizations far beyond what many people imagine. While Western Europe remembered Viking raids, Scandinavians were simultaneously conducting profitable commerce with some of the wealthiest cities in the medieval world. This raises another common misconception. Were Vikings primarily raiders who occasionally traded, or traders who sometimes raided? The evidence suggests there is no simple answer. Different expeditions almost certainly pursued different goals. Some voyages focused on commerce, others on settlement, others on diplomacy, and still others on violence. In some cases, the same individuals may have shifted between these activities depending upon opportunity. A merchant arriving at a friendly port could conduct peaceful business, while another encountering political instability elsewhere might resort to force. Medieval distinctions between trader, explorer, warrior, and settler were often far less rigid than modern categories suggest. Daily life also included recreation and community gatherings. Archaeologists have uncovered gaming pieces made from bone, antler, glass, and stone, indicating that board games were popular forms of entertainment. Musical instruments, including simple harps and bone flutes, appear in both archaeological finds and later literary sources. Storytelling occupied a central place within Scandinavian culture, preserving family histories, heroic tales, poetry, and legal traditions across generations before many were eventually written down in Iceland. Winter evenings, when outdoor work diminished, likely provided opportunities for feasting, games, music, and oral storytelling around the central hearth. Although direct evidence for these moments remains limited, the combination of literary descriptions and archaeological discoveries creates a vivid picture of communities whose lives extended far beyond labor alone. Children, too, emerge from the archaeological record in surprisingly human ways. Small wooden horses, miniature boats, carved dolls, gaming pieces, and other toys have been recovered from Viking settlements. Tiny shoes reveal how young some children were when they first learned to walk across earthen floors. Graves occasionally contain objects buried alongside infants and adolescents, reminding us that childhood was both cherished and precarious in an age when disease and accidents claimed many young lives. These discoveries quietly challenge the stereotype of Viking society as one occupied exclusively by warriors. Behind every expedition stood generations of families whose experiences were far more familiar than legendary. Perhaps the most important lesson modern archaeology has taught us is that violence leaves only part of the historical record. Burned monasteries attract attention because they represent dramatic moments frozen in time. Peaceful farms occupied continuously for centuries often disappear almost invisibly into the landscape, leaving behind only stains in the soil, broken tools, discarded bones, and fragments of pottery. Yet these humble remains vastly outnumber the archaeological traces of warfare. They remind us that history is usually built not by extraordinary events, but by ordinary lives repeated across countless generations. So, were the Vikings really just raiders? The evidence allows us to answer that question with considerable confidence. No. Raiding formed an important part of the Viking Age, particularly during certain periods and in certain regions, but it represented only one activity within a remarkably diverse civilization. The same people who launched surprise attacks also built farms, composed poetry, raised livestock, forged iron, wove sails, governed communities, navigated oceans, traded across continents, and established settlements that endured for centuries. Their world was infinitely richer than the stereotypes that have survived in popular imagination. In the next chapter, we will follow these remarkable seafarers beyond Scandinavia itself, exploring how trade, exploration, and settlement carried them farther across Europe, and eventually across the Atlantic Ocean, than almost anyone of their age believed possible. When people imagine Viking voyages, they often picture longships disappearing over the horizon toward England or Ireland, their crews intent on raiding monasteries and coastal settlements. While such expeditions certainly occurred, they represent only one direction in which the Viking world expanded. During the same centuries that Scandinavian warriors were becoming famous in Western Europe, Viking merchants were quietly building one of the most extensive trading networks of the early medieval world. Their ships sailed not only west across the North Atlantic, but east through the rivers of Russia, south toward the Byzantine Empire, and onward to the great cities of the Islamic world. By the height of the Viking Age, goods, ideas, technologies, and even people were moving across distances that would have seemed extraordinary only a few generations earlier. Modern archaeology has revealed a surprising truth. The Vikings were not merely visitors to Europe's trading system. They became some of its most effective connectors, linking regions that had previously interacted only sporadically. In many respects, they helped knit together 3 continents through commerce long before the concept of international trade existed in its modern form. How do historians know this? Unlike many aspects of Viking history that depend upon only one type of evidence, the story of Viking trade is supported by an unusually rich combination of archaeology, written records, numismatics, the study of coins, scientific analysis of raw materials, and the remains of ancient towns. Each source tells only part of the story, but together they reveal commercial connections stretching thousands of kilometers. A silver coin minted in Baghdad is discovered in Sweden. A walrus ivory carving originating in Greenland appears in England. Silk woven in Central Asia is recovered from a Viking burial in Norway. Byzantine jewelry is unearthed in Denmark. Individually, each object is fascinating. Collectively, they demonstrate that Viking merchants participated in a trading world far larger than Scandinavia itself. One of the first surprises for many people is that the Vikings rarely traveled across empty wilderness. Instead, they became masters of existing waterways. To the east, an extraordinary network of rivers connected the Baltic Sea with the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea. Although these rivers were separated by stretches of land, Viking crews developed techniques for dragging their relatively light ships across short portages between watersheds. It was exhausting work, requiring ropes, rollers, teamwork, and determination, but it opened enormous possibilities. Rivers that flowed south eventually carried Scandinavian merchants towards some of the richest civilizations on Earth. The waterways themselves became commercial highways, where Scandinavian traders interacted with Slavic communities, Finno-Ugric peoples, steppe nomads, Byzantine officials, and Muslim merchants. The Viking world, it turns out, was remarkably multicultural. How do historians know Vikings traveled these eastern routes? Archaeology again provides compelling evidence. Excavations throughout present-day Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus have uncovered Scandinavian-style weapons, jewelry, tools, burial customs, and settlements dating to the Viking Age. In addition, Byzantine and Arabic writers described northern merchants arriving along these rivers, often referring to them as the Rus. While historians continue debating certain details surrounding the origins of the Rus and their relationship with local populations, there is broad agreement that Scandinavian traders played an important role in these expanding commercial networks. Once again, written records from different civilizations reinforce what archaeology already suggests. Among the most remarkable destinations reached by Viking merchants was Constantinople, the magnificent capital of the Byzantine Empire. To Scandinavians, the city became known as Miklagard, meaning the Great City. For travelers arriving from relatively small northern settlements, Constantinople must have appeared almost unimaginable. Massive stone walls surrounded a city whose population likely exceeded several 100,000 people. Great churches crowned the skyline. Bustling markets overflowed with silk, spices, wine, precious metals, perfumes, books, and luxury goods from across Asia, Africa, and Europe. Sophisticated engineering supplied clean water through aqueducts, while monumental public buildings displayed wealth on a scale unknown in Scandinavia. Many Vikings arrived as merchants, while others entered the service of the Byzantine emperors as elite soldiers in the famous Varangian Guard. Their experiences exposed them to one of the most advanced civilizations of the medieval world. How do historians know Vikings served the Byzantine emperors? Here the evidence is unusually strong. Byzantine historians recorded the presence of northern warriors within the imperial guard, while Scandinavian runestones commemorate men who died in Greece, the Norse term often used for lands within the Byzantine Empire. Archaeological discoveries include Byzantine coins, religious objects, and luxury goods found in Scandinavian graves, while written sources from Iceland preserve traditions about men returning from service in Miklagard. Although individual stories cannot always be verified, the broader historical picture is well supported by multiple independent sources. Even farther east lay the great trading centers of the Islamic world. During the Viking Age, the Abbasid Caliphate governed one of history's wealthiest and most scientifically advanced civilizations. Its capital, Baghdad, was among the largest cities on earth, renowned for scholarship, astronomy, mathematics, medicine, engineering, and commerce. Scandinavian merchants rarely traveled all the way to Baghdad itself, but goods and silver from the Islamic world flowed north through extensive commercial networks that crossed Central Asia and Eastern Europe. The evidence for this trade is quite literally buried beneath Scandinavian soil. Archaeologists have recovered tens of thousands of Islamic silver coins from Viking hoards, many still bearing beautifully preserved Arabic inscriptions. These discoveries dramatically changed historians' understanding of Viking commerce. Rather than existing on Europe's remote northern fringe, Scandinavia had become deeply connected to one of the medieval world's economic powerhouses. Numismatics has become one of the most valuable tools for understanding this trade. Coins often bear dates, rulers' names, mint locations, and inscriptions that allow historians to trace their journeys with remarkable precision. Some silver coins found in Sweden were minted only a few years before being buried thousands of kilometers away. Others had been cut into smaller pieces, suggesting that their silver value mattered more than their face value. Historians can compare the distribution of these coins across different regions, revealing how wealth moved through Viking trading networks. Few artifacts tell such detailed stories with so little written explanation. Trade also flowed westward. Scandinavian merchants established important commercial settlements throughout the British Isles, Ireland, and the North Atlantic. Dublin, founded as a Viking longfort, or fortified ship camp, gradually developed into one of medieval Europe's busiest trading centers. York became another major commercial hub, linking Scandinavia with England. Archaeological excavations in both cities have uncovered workshops, imported goods, coins, tools, leather products, textiles, jewelry, and evidence of remarkably diverse populations living side by side. These towns remind us that many Viking settlements were founded not simply as military outposts, but as thriving centers of commerce whose influence lasted long after the Viking Age itself. One particularly fascinating aspect of Viking trade concerns the diversity of goods exchanged. Furs from northern forests remained highly valued throughout Europe and the Middle East. Walrus ivory from Greenland became an important luxury material before elephant ivory was widely available through later trade routes. Timber, iron, soapstone, whetstones, amber, honey, beeswax, dried fish, and textiles all formed part of Scandinavian exports. In return came silver, silk, wine, ceramics, glassware, jewelry, spices, and finely crafted metalwork. Archaeologists even find evidence for the movement of ideas and technologies alongside physical goods. Shipbuilding techniques, artistic styles, religious beliefs, and manufacturing methods all traveled along the same routes that carried merchants and their cargo. This raises another important historical question. Were Viking merchants and Viking raiders entirely separate groups? The evidence suggests the answer is complicated. Some individuals undoubtedly specialized in trade while others specialized in warfare. Yet the distinction was often less rigid than modern readers expect. A successful merchant required navigational skill, knowledge of foreign languages or intermediaries, and the ability to protect valuable cargo in uncertain political environments. Likewise, a warrior returning from a successful expedition often participated in commercial exchange. Medieval societies rarely divided professions as neatly as modern economies do. The same ship might carry trade goods on one voyage and armed men on another, depending upon opportunity and circumstance. One area where historians continue exercising caution concerns the scale of Viking trade. Modern maps showing routes stretching across Eurasia can create the impression of continuous commercial traffic, comparable to modern shipping lanes. The reality was almost certainly less regular. Journeys were seasonal, dangerous, and often dependent upon political stability along hundreds of kilometers of rivers and coastlines. Merchants faced storms, disease, robbery, warfare, mechanical failures, and simple bad luck. Many voyages likely failed completely. The archaeological record naturally favors successful expeditions because they left behind wealth worth burying or possessions worthy of preserving. Countless unsuccessful journeys disappeared without leaving obvious traces. Perhaps the greatest lesson emerging from modern research is that the Viking world was astonishingly interconnected. A farmer in Norway might wear a brooch inspired by Irish craftsmanship, carry a sword forged using techniques influenced by continental Europe, own silver originally minted in the Islamic world, hear stories from travelers who had visited Constantinople, and know relatives preparing to settle newly discovered lands in the North Atlantic. Although medieval life remained local in many respects, the Viking Age connected distant societies in ways that challenge many modern assumptions about the early Middle Ages. As historians continue uncovering new evidence, the old stereotype of the Viking as little more than a northern pirate continues to fade. The archaeological record increasingly reveals merchants negotiating prices in crowded marketplaces, craftsmen adapting foreign artistic styles, sailors memorizing complex river systems, translators bridging cultural divides, and entrepreneurs seeking profit wherever opportunity appeared. Violence undoubtedly accompanied many of these interactions, but commerce proved equally transformative. In many ways, the Vikings were not simply explorers of new lands. They were explorers of new markets, new partnerships, and new worlds of exchange. It was through these commercial networks that Scandinavia ceased to be Europe's distant northern frontier and instead became one of the great crossroads of the medieval world. If the raids on Lindisfarne announced the arrival of the Vikings to the rest of Europe, the settlement of Iceland and Greenland revealed something even more extraordinary about Scandinavian society. The same civilization that had astonished medieval Europe with its speed and ferocity also became one of history's greatest communities of explorers and colonists. These were not temporary military expeditions or seasonal trading voyages. Entire families crossed some of the most dangerous waters on Earth, bringing livestock, tools, seeds, timber, household goods, and dreams of building entirely new lives in lands that, to them, lay at the very edge of the known world. Modern archaeology has shown that these settlements were not reckless adventures driven solely by daring. They were carefully organized migrations that required remarkable planning, sophisticated ships, and an intimate understanding of survival in unforgiving environments. The story of Iceland and Greenland reminds us once again that the Viking Age cannot be understood through warfare alone. It was equally an age of migration, adaptation, and human resilience. How do historians know when Iceland was first settled? Unlike many earlier events in Viking history, the settlement of Iceland benefits from an unusual combination of archaeological evidence and later written tradition. The most famous written source is the Book of Settlements, or Landnámabók, compiled centuries after the initial colonization. It describes hundreds of early settlers, their family relationships, the lands they claimed, and the communities they established. At first glance, such a detailed account might appear to provide everything historians need. Yet, as always, caution is essential. The surviving versions of the Landnámabók were written long after the events they describe, drawing upon earlier traditions that had circulated orally for generations. Historians therefore compare these accounts carefully with archaeological discoveries. Encouragingly, many broad patterns align remarkably well. Excavated farms, radiocarbon dating, volcanic ash layers, and environmental evidence all support the conclusion that large-scale Scandinavian settlement began during the late 9th century, even if some of the finer details preserved in the written tradition remain impossible to verify. One of the most valuable scientific tools for studying Iceland's early history comes not from artifacts, but from volcanoes. Iceland's frequent volcanic eruptions deposit distinctive layers of ash across the landscape, each possessing a unique chemical signature that allows geologists to identify when it was formed. Archaeologists can therefore determine whether a building, field, or settlement existed before or after a particular eruption by examining the position of these ash layers. This technique, known as tephrochronology, has become one of the most powerful methods for dating early Icelandic sites. It represents a wonderful example of how modern science has transformed historical research. Medieval settlers left no precise construction records for their farms, but the volcanoes unintentionally did. Why did people leave Scandinavia for Iceland? Historians continue to debate the relative importance of several different factors. The traditional explanation preserved in the Icelandic sagas emphasizes political conflict. According to these accounts, some families departed Norway to escape the growing authority of King Harald Fairhair as he sought to consolidate power over rival chieftains. Other historians suggest that expanding populations and competition for farmland encouraged migration regardless of political circumstances. Still others emphasize opportunity itself. Iceland possessed extensive grazing lands, abundant fisheries, and no established political hierarchy controlling access to property. For ambitious settlers willing to endure hardship, it represented the possibility of beginning anew. The evidence suggests that all of these motivations may have influenced different families in different ways. Human migration rarely has a single cause. The settlers who reached Iceland did not arrive in an empty paradise. Although the island lacked an indigenous human population, it presented formidable environmental challenges. Much of the interior consisted of volcanic highlands unsuitable for agriculture. Winters were long, timber was relatively scarce, and isolation meant that every community needed to be highly self-reliant. Archaeological excavations reveal how quickly settlers adapted. They constructed longhouses using turf, stone, and the limited timber available, developed livestock farming centered on sheep and cattle, harvested seabirds and fish, and gradually established a network of farms connected by seasonal travel and local assemblies. Their success depended not upon conquering the landscape, but upon learning its limits. How do historians know what daily life looked like in these first Icelandic communities? Excavated farms provide remarkably detailed evidence. Archaeologists have uncovered hearths blackened by centuries of fires, storage pits containing animal bones and fish remains, weaving rooms filled with loom weights, smithies where iron was repaired, and even traces of dairy production preserved in chemical residues absorbed into pottery. Pollen studies reveal where forests were cleared, while animal bones show how settlers adjusted their farming practices over time. Early communities initially relied heavily upon cattle, reflecting Scandinavian traditions, but gradually shifted toward sheep as they adapted to Iceland's harsher conditions. These subtle changes tell a story of experimentation rather than instant success. One of the most remarkable achievements of early Icelandic society was the establishment of the Althing around the year 930. Rather than being ruled by a king, Iceland developed a national assembly where laws were recited, disputes settled, alliances formed, and political decisions debated. The Althing met annually at Thingvellir, a dramatic valley where geological forces slowly pull apart the North American and Eurasian tectonic plates. Today, the location is celebrated both for its natural beauty and its historical significance. Historians often describe the Althing as one of the oldest continuously established parliamentary institutions in the world, although its functions differed considerably from modern democratic legislatures. Even so, its existence demonstrates that Viking society possessed sophisticated legal traditions extending far beyond warfare. Only a few decades after Iceland's settlement, Scandinavian explorers pushed even farther west. According to both the sagas and archaeological evidence, the central figure in this story was Eric the Red, a Norwegian-born settler who had lived in Iceland before being outlawed following a series of violent disputes. During his exile, Eric explored the vast island lying beyond Iceland's western horizon. Upon returning, he promoted this new land enthusiastically, naming it Greenland. Historians have long smiled at this choice of name. Greenland's southern coastal fjords do contain patches of relatively green pasture during summer, but much of the island is dominated by an immense ice sheet. Whether Eric deliberately chose an attractive name to encourage settlement remains uncertain, but the explanation preserved in the sagas has endured because it seems entirely plausible. How do historians know Norse settlers truly established communities in Greenland? Here, archaeology provides exceptionally strong confirmation. Excavations have uncovered the remains of hundreds of farms, churches, barns, workshops, cemeteries, and irrigation systems scattered throughout Greenland's southwestern fjords. Animal bones reveal diets based upon cattle, sheep, goats, seals, fish, and occasional caribou. Imported goods demonstrate continued trade with Iceland and Norway, while locally produced walrus ivory became one of Greenland's most valuable exports. These discoveries leave little doubt that substantial Norse communities flourished there for centuries. Yet Greenland also illustrates the limits of human adaptation. Farming at the very edge of the Arctic required extraordinary resilience. Summers were brief, winters severe, and every harvest uncertain. Timber remained scarce, forcing settlers to conserve wood carefully and import what they could. Walrus hunting became increasingly important because ivory could be exchanged in Europe for iron, timber, grain, and other necessities unavailable locally. Archaeological evidence suggests that Greenlanders gradually relied more heavily upon marine resources as environmental conditions changed. Some historians connect this shift to the cooling climate associated with the onset of the Little Ice Age, although climate alone probably does not explain the colony's eventual disappearance. Once again, historians encounter a familiar pattern. The evidence supports several contributing factors rather than one simple cause. One enduring mystery concerns the relationship between Norse settlers and the indigenous peoples of the Arctic. The ancestors of today's Inuit migrated into Greenland after the Norse settlements had already been established. Archaeological evidence indicates that these cultures were aware of one another, and there is limited evidence suggesting occasional contact, trade, or perhaps conflict. Exactly how extensive these interactions were remains uncertain because the surviving evidence is sparse. Historians therefore resist dramatic conclusions unsupported by archaeology. This uncertainty reminds us that even relatively recent chapters of Viking history still contain unanswered questions. Perhaps the most striking lesson emerging from Iceland and Greenland is how different these settlements were from the image of Viking conquest that dominates popular imagination. These communities succeeded not because they defeated great armies, but because they mastered logistics. Every voyage required planning months in advance. Ships carried livestock that needed feeding during the crossing, seeds for future harvests, iron tools that could not easily be replaced, families prepared to endure isolation, and enough supplies to survive until the first successful growing season. The true achievement lay not in reaching these distant lands, but in remaining there year after year despite extraordinary challenges. As historians continue excavating farms buried beneath volcanic ash in Iceland and abandoned beneath Greenland's windswept turf, they uncover a civilization defined as much by persistence as by adventure. These settlers crossed oceans without compasses, weather forecasts, or detailed charts. They established functioning communities in places that many Europeans scarcely believed existed. They built legal systems, churches, farms, and trading networks at the very edge of the medieval world. Their success prepared the way for an even more astonishing voyage, one that would carry Scandinavian explorers beyond Greenland to the shores of North America itself. There, archaeology would eventually confirm one of the most remarkable stories preserved in the Icelandic sagas, demonstrating once again that beneath the legends of the Vikings often lies a remarkable historical truth waiting patiently to be uncovered. For centuries, one story from the Icelandic sagas occupied a curious place somewhere between history and legend. It spoke of Scandinavian sailors who ventured beyond Greenland into lands even farther west, where forests grew in abundance, Rivers teemed with salmon and wild grapes, or perhaps berries mistaken for grapes, covered the landscape. These places were given names such as Helluland, Markland, and Vinland, and according to the sagas, Norse explorers briefly established a settlement there nearly 500 years before Christopher Columbus crossed the Atlantic. For generations, historians debated whether these stories preserved genuine memories of exploration or whether they belonged alongside the heroic legends that had accumulated around Viking history. Then, during the 20th century, archaeology produced one of its most remarkable triumphs. What had long been regarded as a medieval tale suddenly became one of the best examples of how physical evidence can transform our understanding of history. The Vikings really had reached North America. How do historians know this? Unlike many chapters of Viking history that rely heavily upon later written traditions, the evidence for Norse activity in North America now rests upon one extraordinary archaeological site. In the early 1960s, Norwegian explorer Helge Ingstad and archaeologist Anne Stein Ingstad investigated local traditions on the northern tip of Newfoundland in eastern Canada. Residents described unusual grassy mounds that did not resemble ordinary natural formations. Careful excavation revealed something astonishing. Beneath the turf lay the remains of Norse-style buildings constructed using techniques already familiar from Iceland and Greenland. The settlement contained longhouses, workshops, iron-working facilities, and unmistakable evidence of Scandinavian craftsmanship dating to approximately the year 1000. The site, now known as Lanceau Meadows, fundamentally changed the history of European exploration. The discovery succeeded because archaeologists recognized details that others had overlooked. The buildings followed construction methods characteristic of Norse settlements rather than indigenous architecture. Iron nails and rivets matched those used in Viking ships. A spindle whorl demonstrated that textile work had taken place there, implying the presence of women as well as men. Perhaps most importantly, evidence of iron smelting revealed a technology unknown among the indigenous peoples living in Newfoundland at the time. Taken individually, these discoveries might have invited alternative explanations. Together, they formed an overwhelming body of evidence confirming that Scandinavian explorers had established at least one temporary settlement on the North American continent. This raises an obvious question. If archaeology has confirmed a Norse settlement in Newfoundland, does that mean every detail preserved in the Icelandic sagas is historically accurate? The answer, once again, illustrates the careful balance historians must maintain between written tradition and physical evidence. Two principal sagas describe the voyages to North America, the Saga of the Greenlanders and the Saga of Eric the Red. Both recount expeditions involving Leif Erikson and other explorers, yet they differ significantly in chronology, emphasis, and certain events. One version credits Leif with discovering Vinland after accidentally drifting off course while returning from Norway. The other presents the voyage as a more deliberate expedition inspired by earlier sightings of land. Historians therefore conclude that while the sagas preserve genuine historical memories, they cannot always be treated as precise eyewitness accounts. Like many oral traditions eventually written down centuries later, they blend historical fact with literary storytelling. Leif Erikson himself occupies a fascinating position within Viking history. According to the sagas, he was the son of Eric the Red, the founder of Greenland's Norse colony. If these accounts are broadly correct, then the exploration of North America represented not an isolated voyage but the continuation of a remarkable family tradition of westward expansion. Norway had led to Iceland. Iceland had led to Greenland. Greenland, in turn, became the launching point for voyages even farther across the Atlantic. Archaeology strongly supports this broader pattern, even if individual conversations and dramatic episodes described in the sagas remain impossible to verify. The names assigned to the lands encountered during these voyages also provide clues. Helluland, generally interpreted as Land of Flat Stones, is widely believed to correspond to Baffin Island, whose barren rocky landscapes match the descriptions reasonably well. Markland, or Forest Land, is commonly associated with Labrador, where extensive forests would have offered a valuable resource to timber-poor Greenland. Vinland presents the greatest challenge. Traditionally translated as Wine Land, the name appears puzzling because grapes do not naturally grow in Newfoundland today. Some historians suggest that Norse explorers may have traveled farther south than Lanceau Meadows, reaching regions where wild grapes were available. Others argue that the Old Norse word may have referred more broadly to meadows or berry-producing landscapes rather than vineyards in the Mediterranean sense. The evidence remains inconclusive, reminding us once again that certainty often gives way to informed interpretation. One of the most intriguing aspects of Lanceau Meadows is what it does not appear to have been. Archaeological evidence suggests the settlement was relatively small and occupied for only a limited period, perhaps a decade or less. There is little indication of the large farming communities seen in Iceland or Greenland. Instead, historians believe the site functioned as a seasonal base for exploration, ship repair, resource gathering, and perhaps expeditions farther south. Iron production appears to have focused on repairing nails and rivets needed for ocean-going vessels, rather than supporting a permanently expanding colony. In other words, Lanceau Meadows may have served as a gateway rather than a final destination. How do historians estimate how long the settlement remained occupied? Radiocarbon dating provides part of the answer, while careful analysis of building repairs, accumulated refuse, and environmental evidence offers additional clues. More recently, advances in tree ring dating have narrowed the chronology even further. Timber recovered from the site preserves evidence of metal tool marks made during a period corresponding closely with the early 11th century. Combined with the archaeological context, these findings reinforce the conclusion that Norse explorers reached Newfoundland around the year 1000. Scientific dating techniques have therefore confirmed what the sagas suggested, even though they cannot verify every narrative detail. Perhaps the most sensitive and important aspect of this history concerns the indigenous peoples whom the Norse encountered. Long before Scandinavian ships reached Newfoundland, North America had been inhabited for thousands of years by diverse indigenous cultures with rich traditions, sophisticated knowledge of their environments, and extensive trade networks of their own. The sagas refer to local inhabitants using the Old Norse term skralingar, a word whose precise meaning remains debated but which reflected the Norse perspective rather than indigenous identities. Archaeological evidence indicates that contact occurred, although exactly how frequently remains uncertain. The sagas describe episodes of trade alongside episodes of violence, suggesting relationships that were complex rather than uniformly hostile or peaceful. Because indigenous societies of the region left different kinds of historical evidence than medieval Scandinavians, historians continue piecing together this chapter from archaeology, oral traditions, and careful interpretation rather than relying solely on the Norse accounts. Why then did the Norse not establish permanent colonies in North America as they had in Iceland and Greenland? Historians have proposed several explanations. Distance certainly played a role. Even from Greenland, voyages to Vinland required crossing open ocean, making communication and resupply difficult. Greenland itself remained a fragile colony dependent upon trade with Iceland and Norway. Supporting another settlement still farther west would have stretched available resources considerably. Relations with indigenous communities may also have discouraged permanent expansion if conflict proved difficult to avoid. Economic incentives mattered as well. Timber could be harvested during seasonal expeditions without requiring large permanent populations. If valuable resources could be obtained through periodic voyages, maintaining a distant colony may simply have offered too few advantages relative to its considerable risks. One of the enduring myths surrounding Viking exploration is that Columbus somehow stole the discovery of America from the Vikings, or that the Norse voyages somehow diminished the significance of 1492. Historians reject this false choice. The Norse unquestionably reached North America first, as archaeology now demonstrates. Yet their settlements remained limited in duration and had little lasting influence upon European knowledge of the continent. Columbus's voyages, by contrast, initiated sustained contact between Europe and the Americas that permanently reshaped global history. These are two distinct historical events separated by nearly 5 centuries, each important for different reasons. Recognizing one does not diminish the other. The discovery of Lanceau Meadows also teaches historians something broader about their discipline. For generations, many scholars dismissed the Vinland sagas because they seemed too extraordinary to believe. Others accepted them almost entirely on faith. Archaeology demonstrated a more satisfying approach. Rather than assuming either complete truth or complete fiction, historians patiently tested the stories against physical evidence. The result was a far richer understanding than either extreme could have provided. Some elements of the sagas proved remarkably accurate. Others remain uncertain. Still others likely belong to the realm of literary tradition. History advanced not because anyone won an argument, but because new evidence emerged. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the Vinland story is what it reveals about Viking ambition. By the beginning of the 11th century, Scandinavian sailors had reached lands extending from the Arctic to the Mediterranean, from the rivers of Russia to the coast of North America. Their ships carried them farther across the Atlantic than any known Europeans before them. They accomplished these voyages without magnetic compasses, accurate nautical charts, or modern navigation. They relied instead upon generations of accumulated maritime knowledge, extraordinary shipbuilding, careful observation of the natural world, and a willingness to venture beyond horizons where no written map could guide them. The archaeological remains at Los Olmedos are modest compared with the ruins of Rome or Constantinople, yet they stand among the most significant discoveries in medieval archaeology. They remind us that beneath the windswept turf of Newfoundland lay proof that one of history's greatest voyages had never been a legend at all. It had simply been waiting for archaeology to uncover it. Every historical era eventually comes to an end, although rarely in the dramatic fashion suggested by textbooks. The Viking Age is no exception. It is tempting to imagine that one decisive battle, one powerful king, or one sudden cultural transformation brought nearly 3 centuries of Scandinavian expansion to a close. Reality, as we have discovered throughout this book, was far more gradual. The world that produced the Vikings slowly changed from within, while the societies they had once raided, traded with, and settled also evolved around them. Political authority became more centralized. Christianity spread throughout Scandinavia. European kingdoms developed stronger defenses and more effective governments. Trade routes shifted, economies matured, and new opportunities gradually replaced old ones. By the middle of the 11th century, the civilization that had launched longships across the seas had not disappeared. Instead, it had become something different. The Viking Age ended not because the Scandinavian peoples vanished, but because the conditions that had given rise to the Viking Age itself no longer existed. How do historians decide when the Viking Age ended? Unlike the beginning of the period, which is traditionally associated with the raid on Lindisfarne in 793, its conclusion is less precisely defined. Most historians use the year 1066 as a convenient endpoint. That year witnessed the Battle of Stamford Bridge in northern England, where the Norwegian king Harald Hardrada was defeated and killed while attempting to claim the English throne. Only weeks later, William, Duke of Normandy, successfully invaded England at the Battle of Hastings. The coincidence is historically striking. Harald Hardrada is often described as the last great Viking king, while William himself was descended from Scandinavian settlers who had established Normandy generations earlier. In a sense, both armies carried elements of the Viking past. One represented the fading tradition of overseas Viking expeditions, while the other demonstrated how thoroughly Viking descendants had become integrated into medieval European society. It is important to understand that 1066 serves primarily as a historical marker, rather than a precise moment of transformation. Scandinavian merchants continued trading. Scandinavian kings continued ruling. Scandinavian sailors continued crossing northern seas. What had changed was the character of their societies. Denmark, Norway, and Sweden increasingly resembled the organized Christian kingdoms developing elsewhere in Europe. Royal authority expanded. Churches became central institutions. Written law gradually supplemented oral tradition, and diplomatic relationships often proved more profitable than seasonal raiding. The descendants of the Vikings had become participants in a changing medieval Europe, rather than outsiders operating along its frontiers. One of the most significant forces behind this transformation was Christianity. Earlier chapters described how many of the Vikings encountered Christian monasteries as wealthy but vulnerable targets. Over time, however, Christianity spread steadily throughout Scandinavia itself. Missionaries traveled north. Kings recognized that adopting Christianity strengthened diplomatic ties with powerful European neighbors. Local rulers increasingly supported church construction, while bishops established dioceses across the region. Archaeology vividly illustrates this transition. Pagan burial mounds gradually gave way to Christian cemeteries. Grave goods became less common as Christian burial customs spread. Churches began appearing where earlier generations had gathered at pagan sacred sites. Yet the transition was neither immediate nor uniform. For many decades, older beliefs and newer religious practices existed side by side, blending in ways that historians continue to study today. How do historians know when these religious changes occurred? Once again, multiple forms of evidence work together. Archaeologists examine burial practices, church foundations, religious artifacts, and inscriptions. Written records from missionaries and royal courts describe conversions, although these accounts sometimes exaggerate the speed or completeness of Christianization. Runestones erected during the late Viking Age occasionally contain Christian crosses alongside traditional Norse artistic styles, providing tangible evidence of societies in transition. Rather than imagining an abrupt replacement of one religion by another, historians increasingly describe a long process during which communities gradually adapted to changing political, social, and spiritual realities. Political change proved equally important. During the early Viking Age, much of Scandinavia consisted of relatively small kingdoms and regional chieftaincies, competing for influence. By the 11th century, stronger monarchies had emerged. Kings possessed greater authority to collect taxes, enforce laws, raise armies, and regulate trade. Improved administration reduced the independence that had once allowed ambitious leaders to organize overseas expeditions with relatively little oversight. As governments became more centralized, the incentives encouraging private raiding gradually diminished. Wealth could increasingly be acquired through royal service, lawful commerce, and expanding domestic economies, rather than through dangerous expeditions abroad. Meanwhile, the rest of Europe was changing as well. The kingdoms that had suffered repeated Viking attacks during the 9th century were no longer the fragmented societies they had once been. England developed more effective systems of defense under rulers such as Alfred the Great and his successors. Coastal fortifications improved. Standing military forces became more organized. Continental rulers strengthened castles, expanded taxation, and coordinated regional responses to external threats. Monasteries themselves became better protected, while political consolidation reduced opportunities for small raiding parties to strike isolated communities with impunity. In many respects, Europe learned from centuries of Viking attacks and gradually adapted to them. Trade also continued evolving. Earlier chapters explored the remarkable commercial networks connecting Scandinavia with the Byzantine Empire, the Islamic world, and the North Atlantic. These networks did not disappear after the Viking Age. Instead, they became increasingly integrated into broader medieval trading systems, dominated by growing towns, expanding markets, and more formal political relationships. Scandinavian merchants remained active participants in European commerce, but their activities became less distinctive as maritime trade expanded throughout the continent. The skills that had once enabled Viking exploration now contributed to the development of medieval Europe's commercial economy. One question often asked by modern readers concerns the fate of the Norse settlements established beyond Scandinavia. Iceland continued to flourish, preserving an extraordinary literary tradition that eventually produced the sagas upon which so much of our knowledge depends. Greenland survived for several centuries before its Norse communities gradually disappeared during the late Middle Ages, probably as the result of multiple interacting factors including environmental change, economic isolation, shifting trade patterns, and demographic challenges. Vinland, as we have seen, appears to have remained only a brief chapter in Norse expansion, rather than becoming a permanent colony. These differing outcomes remind historians that exploration itself does not guarantee lasting settlement. Success depended upon geography, economics, politics, climate, and countless other variables. Perhaps nowhere is the Viking legacy more visible than in language. Modern English contains hundreds of words inherited from Old Norse through centuries of interaction between Scandinavian settlers and the inhabitants of the British Isles. Everyday words such as sky, window, knife, husband, egg, law, skill, wrong, anger, and even the pronouns they, them, and their all entered English through Norse influence. This linguistic legacy is remarkable because it demonstrates how deeply Scandinavian settlers became integrated into local communities. Languages rarely borrow their most basic vocabulary from distant enemies alone. Such changes usually emerge through generations of ordinary people living, trading, marrying, and raising families together. The Vikings also left lasting marks upon geography itself. Across Britain, Ireland, Normandy, Iceland, Greenland, and parts of Eastern Europe, place names preserve echoes of Scandinavian settlement more than 1,000 years later. Archaeological sites, churches, legal traditions, and patterns of land ownership continue to reveal the influence of Norse communities. Even political institutions, such as Iceland's Althing, remind us that Viking society developed forms of governance whose significance extends well beyond the medieval period. At the same time, many popular images of the Vikings have gradually faded under the weight of modern scholarship. The horned helmet belongs to 19th century imagination rather than archaeological reality. The idea that every Viking spent his life raiding monasteries has given way to evidence of farmers, merchants, craftspeople, lawmakers, poets, navigators, and explorers. The notion that they existed on the fringes of civilization has been replaced by a far richer understanding of their participation in commercial networks stretching from North America to Central Asia. Each generation of archaeological discoveries has revealed a society more sophisticated, more interconnected, and more human than earlier stereotypes allowed. This brings us to the final question that has guided our journey from the beginning of this book. What do historians know about the Vikings? We know that they were extraordinary sailors who mastered some of the world's most challenging seas. We know they built remarkably efficient ships, established settlements across the North Atlantic, traded with civilizations separated by thousands of kilometers, and briefly reached North America centuries before Columbus. We know they transformed the political landscape of Britain, Ireland, Normandy, Iceland, Greenland, and parts of Eastern Europe. We know they possessed rich artistic traditions, sophisticated legal institutions, and cultures shaped by both hardship and opportunity. How do historians know these things? They know because of archaeology, where abandoned farms, ship burials, workshops, churches, and forgotten settlements quietly preserve the material evidence of everyday life. They know because of runestones carved by people who wished to remember loved ones long after they were gone. They know because medieval chroniclers, despite their biases and limitations, recorded encounters that otherwise would have been lost forever. They know because geologists study volcanic ash, because chemists analyze ancient metals, because linguists trace the evolution of words, because geneticists examine ancient DNA, because historians compare dozens of independent sources rather than relying upon any single one. The history of the Vikings has not emerged from one spectacular discovery. It has been assembled patiently, piece by piece, across generations of scholarship. And where does uncertainty remain? In more places than many readers might expect. We still debate why certain migrations occurred. We continue discussing the exact routes taken by explorers, the scale of some settlements, the nature of contacts with indigenous peoples in North America, and the complex motivations behind countless historical decisions. New excavations continue to reshape long-held assumptions, while advances in scientific techniques reveal information that earlier historians could scarcely have imagined obtaining. History is never truly finished. Every answer has the potential to generate new questions. Perhaps that is the greatest lesson the Vikings leave behind. They remind us that history is not a collection of fixed stories carved permanently into stone. It is an ongoing conversation between the past and the present, guided by evidence, curiosity, and the willingness to change our minds when new discoveries appear. The Vikings themselves were explorers who constantly ventured beyond familiar horizons, accepting uncertainty as the price of discovery. In an unexpected way, historians have inherited that same spirit. Every excavation, every newly translated inscription, every ship uncovered beneath ancient soil, and every scientific breakthrough carries us a little farther into a world that once seemed lost. The Vikings have long since vanished, but the search to understand them continues. And perhaps that more than any legend of warriors or kings is their most enduring legacy.